I'm still learning how to use YouTube. I went through a whole thing. I was talking for probably 15 minutes and I just realized that I never hit the live button. I thought because I saw my picture. Anyway, welcome to live. This is the Montessori 5 on Friday. In this live stream, I cover 5 categories every week. It's the same categories, but I cover something slightly different. And I hope you join me each week to learn a little bit more about Montessori, parenting, and child development. My name is Mariana Bissonette. I am the founder of the Peace Program, the author of Babies Build Toddlers, and I've just launched a new app with a team of international Montessori educators who are working with families in the same way that I am. So I'm really excited to have you here. Montessori 5 on Fridays, the 5 categories that we cover each week. I'm going to talk through a Montessori toy. I'm going to talk through a non-Montessori toy. I'm going to talk through some kind of practical life or practical living, something, maybe it's around meal times or maybe it's around hygiene and toothbrushing. So something practical life. We're going to talk through a book, and then we're going to answer a parent question that I find on the internet. So hopefully you join me and I will be very happy to answer your specific questions. And yeah, let's get started. So Montessori toy. So first, what do we mean by that? So what we mean by that is I would say there's a lot of things that people have to say about what a Montessori toy is or isn't. And sometimes people will say, oh, it's wooden, or it's like this, or it's like that. So Montessori is much more about how things are used than what things are. There are some things that are understood to be part of a Montessori sort of scope and sequence of things that you tend to find if you're at a Montessori care provider. Certainly there's a scope and sequence when you get into the primary, the 3 to 6-year-old age group. But for 0 to 3, there's a lot more flexibility. But so what I would think in your head in terms of what is a Montessori toy versus what isn't, is around how much of a direct line can we make to the child's development versus not. Because Montessori toys, there's a tremendous amount of intentionality around the material that the child is using so that hopefully it's in service to the child's development. It's a tool that they can use to fulfill the potential of the development they're trying to do. Whereas conventional toys often will not be as obviously connected to the child's development. We might be able to tie some lines to it to try to understand where this toy or material is coming from, but it's not like an obvious thing. Usually the vantage point that conventional toys are going to have is entertainment, that this is something that occupies the child, that this is something that entertains them. And that's a really different frame of reference than a Montessori toy. So a Montessori toy is really going to start with what is the child's development? How is this going to be a tool that the child can use to maximize that development or to reach their own potential? Similarly, if we're in a kitchen and we're trying to cook a meal, there are tools that we're going to be reaching for. And sometimes those tools, despite their very best intention, are not actually helping me reach the potential of this meal. They're getting in my way. I thought they were going to be great and then they weren't great, but ultimately me as the person cooking, I have to use the tools that I need to create the meal that I can. And hopefully I can be responsive to adjusting the environment or having different tools. So that's the role that we play in the environment with children, especially when we're using Montessori toys, is that we are trying to give them tools that they can build their own development. So the first 2 categories we're going to talk through are Montessori toys. And I already went through this 15 minutes ago. When I wasn't live. So I'm going to go through it again, but luckily I have all my talking points. So the Montessori toy that I wanted to highlight, it's really simple DIY, and it's called a ring on a ribbon. Some of you might have seen this or heard about it. It's really simple. It does not have to be a ring, but there's a lot of intentionality about what this toy is intending to provide for a child who's just starting to grasp. So let's place ourselves in the child's development. This particular kind of toy is best serving the child between 3 and 6 months, and I'll tell you why. So the child is developing their motor skills through a process of myelination, which I'll explain what that is, and then practice. So we know that the child can kick in the womb. They've been kicking since 7 months in utero. So we already know that their legs work, but then they come out and they don't walk for a year plus. So what's the deal there? We know that the legs work, and it's the lack of a fatty sheath called myelin that takes time to grow around the signals that are being sent from the brain to the body and back again. Without that fatty sheath, the signal keeps getting lost. Body works, brain works, signals getting lost. So myelin is just like the casing around an electrical wire. So if you imagine you have a plant, you have a lamp, and the light bulb works, the lamp works, the outlet works, right? So where the electricity is going to be coming from totally works. Where the electricity is headed absolutely works. But there's no casing around the electrical wires. When you plug that in, it's going to spark everywhere and the lamp will not turn on. So that's the same thing with myelin, is that the brain and the body are sending signals to each other, but because there's no protective layer, the signals are just getting lost. So as the child develops, the child starts growing myelin, and we can see them starting to be in control of those muscle groups. So the first thing they need to do is have the signal not get lost, and then they need to practice. So we can't just connect the two, then the child needs to actually make sure it as well practiced and well versed in how to coordinate their movements. So when the child is born, usually the myelin is here. When the earliest thing that's getting myelinated is around the mouth, so that the child has the capacity to suck. Now, if a child is born prematurely, one of the earliest things that they struggle with is having the sucking motion be strong enough to get the food that they need. So if they're born 2 months premature, it's because the myelin has not reached here yet. But usually by 40 weeks, the myelin has reached here. And then usually 2 months postpartum, when the child is 2 months old, the myelin has reached down through the neck, which is why they can hold their head up. Then the myelin keeps building and it goes down through the upper torso. And by around 4 months, the child can roll. And then the myelin continues growing and it reaches down through the lower torso and the child can sit. And on and on and on we go until the child is walking. So once something is myelinated, then the child needs to actually practice with it. They need to practice sending the signals from the brain to the body to be able to do the thing that the body was trying to do. So the lack of myelin is one of the reasons why in the first 3 months we see a lot of reflexive movements, but not coordinated sort of specific movements that the child wanted to do. And 3 to 6 months, we start seeing more sort of active participation, active movements, because they finally are sending signals that are getting to their destination. So between 3 and 6 months, I talked about the gross motor movements, but the fine motor movements are following a similar path. So the myelin is getting down through the arms around 3 months, and by 6 months, it's all the way down through the hands. And then 6 to 12 months, the child is now trying to get all the practice specifically with all of their fingers, not just their hands. So it's not surprising that between 3 and 6 months, that's usually when you start seeing the child grasping. And it might start with an arm grasp where the child is going towards a toy, but they're not actually holding it. So that is telling us that the myelin has gone down through the arm, but it's not actually in the hand yet. So back to our Montessori toy, given that, we have a ring on a ribbon. There is a lot of intentionality around that, because if I give the child a handheld toy, what are they going to do with it at 3 months? They might hold it briefly, but then they're going to let go of it. They don't have the object permanence to know that it's missing, and they can't even roll over to go get it. So it's pretty complicated for us to expect that they can go find this thing that they've dropped. And so then the child is upset, and then we hand them the toy again. And then they drop it because that's what they will do as they're learning to grasp. And then we have to hand it back to them. And so the child's ability to use their environment to build a skill is all tied up in the parent or the caregiver's availability. Am I available to constantly hand this toy back to the child? Whereas if you just hang it on a ribbon, a ring on a ribbon, or whatever you're going to hang on here, all of a sudden when the child lets go of it, it's still here for the child to grasp. The other thing that's going to happen is that the child is going to get tactile feedback about how they're grasping, right? So if they go like this, right? They're getting the feedback that they're not doing something completely right in terms of trying to get to the action that they want until they grab a hold of it, and then they get that feedback that sends to the brain of, hey, do that again. That's the thing that you're supposed to be doing to actually hold on to this. And so by having this, it can be really helpful for the child, because if we imagine 3 to 6 months, the child's, they're getting myelinated down through the hand, and they are absolutely interested in grasping, but if they have nothing to grasp, then they have no feedback about how well or how little they're doing it. So the myelin's there, great, but they're not actually being given the opportunity to practice. And an under-practiced hand is going to be a tremendous obstacle to the child's skills. So how much of the day do you use your hands to accomplish your task? And do you, during the day, whether you're washing dishes or taking the kids to whatever, or eating, how much of your day is using your hands? And we want to be thinking from that perspective that the better these are, the better you're able to do the things that you're trying to do during the day. So it's really helpful to allow the child, as they build this myelin, once they finally have this capacity, that we give them the opportunity to practice, which is why the ring on the ribbon is here. Now, sometimes families will have a play gym that will have hanging things. And sometimes that can be really distracting for the child because it's got a number of things and it's hard to tell what is supposed to be interesting, and it's also often overstimulated. I can't tell you how many times I've done a home visit with a family in this range, and they say somewhere around 3 months, the child is all of a sudden completely overstimulated, or maybe it's 4 months, in their play area. They used to love it, and now what happened? They don't like it anymore. And so many times I've worked with families and I said, take everything off, everything but one, and the child calms down. And it's because there's another development that's happening beyond their motor development, and it's in their eyesight. So around 4 months, the child, and it can happen a little bit earlier, but around 4 months, the child's eyesight extends from this very narrow perspective where everything is fuzzy beyond here to actually seeing across the room. So that means that the child's same situation that they were seeing only this, they're now seeing everything. And so what used to be rather like a perfect amount of stimulation is now all of a sudden completely overwhelming to the child. So typically in this kind of setup with a ring on a ribbon is not necessarily in a play gym, or if you are using a play gym, that it's one central item and it's not a million other things. But the other thing that we have typically in Montessori toys is that this particular item is hung from a distance. So that not only supports the child's work on color maturation because it's brightly colored, but also depth perception because it's being hung from a ceiling or from something higher up than a play gym. I used a play gym that was sort of my like mobile area. If like I was in the kitchen and I had my 3-month-old, but the standard play space where there was some kind of, mild permanence to it, the corner of the living room, something like that, I did put a hook in the ceiling so that I could hang something like this. And you can use an adhesive hook. There's some, this is pretty light. But the idea is that that we can support the child's development in all the things that we're working on, motor skills, color maturation, depth perception, through the intentionality of how we use this kind of toy. The other thing that's added to this kind of Montessori toy is a bell. So often there's a bell hung higher up on the ribbon, because that's going to be additional feedback for the child in a different sense of how to do grasping, to tell the child without me having to tell them about whether or not they're accomplishing what they want. So we talked about the tactile feedback. As the child bats this, they can feel that it's not in their hand, right? But as soon as they get a hold of it, they get that information sent to their brain that, ooh, I did something. How do I do that? How do I replicate that? But also the bell on the higher part of the ribbon is going to give feedback if the child is even close. So if the child bats this way, there's no sound. But as soon as the child bats here, now all of a sudden I get auditory feedback that I'm close. It's kind of like Marco Polo, that the child is getting closer and closer, which is really important feedback. So Montessori toys are really, you will have the ability with Montessori toys to tie a direct line from the activity to the child's development, because the toys are not for entertainment. They're not teaching the child something. We're not teaching the child color. We're not teaching the child depth perception. These are tools. Just like I mentioned, if you were in a kitchen, you're using certain tools to make your dish. That's what the child is doing with the environment. They're using the things in the environment to be able to do the development that they're trying to do. And if we know what they're trying to do, like I know you're trying to grasp because the myelin is probably reached. I know you're working on depth perception and color. And if I give you things that will likely be the tools that help foster that, then you will have your needs met developmentally, because you really will be able to maximize the potential of that skill. So this is the ring on the ribbon. This is a Montessori toy that is pretty common, and it's very DIY. So this broadcast, we're talking about, this is our Friday 5. We're doing a Montessori toy, a non-Montessori toy, something related to practical life or daily living, like meal times or, hygiene, something. We're going to talk about a book, and then we're going to answer a parent's question that I find on the internet. And if you have questions or you want to pop them in the chat, please feel free. As I get used to and accustomed to these broadcasts, I am learning, like I did at the very beginning when I was talking for 15 minutes and didn't know I was live. Okay, so the next one. So category 2, non-Montessori toy. So I've picked out these. I had these for my kids. I use them a lot, so it's not saying anything is right or wrong. It's just, is there a developmental line that we can tie to these? So we can probably come up with some developmental lines of why these possibly can exist, but I would argue that they're probably not built in a way that really centers the child's development. It's just that we can think about it and sort of say, all right, why do these exist? And how could I use them in a way that centers the child's development? So first of all, one of the things that's nice about these is if you are going to hang something and you're only lightly supervising, so you're trying to do the dishes or you're, going to the bathroom or something, these will automatically clip apart. So that can feel like a nice safety perk for you to feel really comfortable with the child pulling on something, because it's not going to turn into something that wraps around them. 3 months old, they're not going very far, but this might be something that feels helpful. The other thing that I'll note is that often, and this is pretty typical for conventional toys, so non-Montessori toys, is that they're very brightly colored. So if we think about that from the perspective of the child 3 to 6 months who's developing color maturation, right, there's not something specific to engaging with this one versus this one. I'm just sort of engaging with all of them. Whereas the Montessori toy very specifically has a sort of like natural wood, fine. It's just sort of a not a brightly colored material here, because what I'm trying to do is to draw the child's attention to this brightly colored thing for the extension, because they're trying to develop depth perception. That means that they are under practiced with it. Yes, they can see across, but how do they engage their eyes to be able to see all of the details as they start seeing all the way across the room? So this is encouraging them to look here and it's encouraging them through their grasping to touch here. So we're intentionally using color to highlight rather than everything is all different colors, because then there's no highlight. Is this particular one more important than this one? We don't know. But in the Montessori toy, it's intentionally using color to highlight. So you'll see that throughout Montessori toys, is that there is an intentionality around using color to draw the child's attention to this one particular thing that might be really impactful to their development, as opposed to everything being colorful. And then the last thing I would point out about this one is there is auditory feedback. So if this was hung, if the child grabbed a hold of it or was near it, it's similar to the bell, that there is some auditory feedback of getting closer. And the question is the child interested in the more dull auditory feedback? Are they interested in the more higher pitched bell? Or are they both kind of interesting and they like both kinds? So that's an example of a conventional toy. And yeah, so that's our conventional toy. I'm not saying, it's not about right or wrong. It is about trying to understand, is there a developmental connection to why this exists? Category 3 of 5, we're almost there. So category 3, we're going to be talking through practical life. So every week I'm going to pick something about practical life. And today I want to talk about meal times, starting salads, and utensils. And I will always talk about sort of a more conventional sort of approach versus the Montessori approach, to sort of delineate between the two. So the first thing I would say about Montessori eating and where sort of Montessori's perspective is coming from is Montessori is one of the few approaches to eating that really centers the child's cultural experience. And that's, I'll preface that with, as it relates to conventional eating and as it relates to things like baby-led weaning. There are plenty of food programs that are extremely traditional in a lot of communities and cultures that do food in a way that they've done food for generations and generations, that very much saturate with culture. So I'm specifically talking about the conventional approach to food, and I'll preface that with the sort of Western conventional approach to food, and some ideas of baby-led weaning, which is seen as an alternative to that conventional Western approach, and then where Montessori kind of fits with that. So Montessori is super focused on the culture of food, because food is culture. We know that kids eat and meet their nutritional needs all around the world, all the time. And there's not a specific food or type of food that babies need to have as human babies for their own development that is only one kind of food. We know that kids are meeting their developmental and nutritional needs all around the world with all different kinds of food. We know that the kinds of food that people eat are related to the kinds of food that is grown in that region. So that's where there's this cultural food. There's also a ton of pride around food. There's a lot of community around food. So no matter if you're experiencing a happy occasion, like a wedding or a celebration, or a sad occasion, like a death or some other thing that's going on, there's often food related to that occasion. It's not something that people gather and then there's no food. Usually food is a central feature of gelling community together. And that food people have a lot of pride in, and there's a lot of culture behind the food. So in the conventional sort of Western approach to baby feeding, it's often that kids will be encouraged to eat a singular kind of food, often sort of a cereal-based food, which is not developmentally necessary. And it's often not what the family is eating. So there starts to become a cultural disconnection of the child from the family's culture. And then we become surprised that if that's how we introduce solids at 6 months, and then we fast forward a year at 18 months, and we expect a child to be able to be involved in the culture of food. So to be able to eat with the family or eat at a restaurant or whatever it is, for them to have those skills, it's of course they're not going to have those skills. They're often separated from the family. They're often their whole eating experience looks nothing like the family's eating experience. And so it's no wonder that the child has oriented to one thing and then we're asking them to shift gears. So Montessori weaning is so much about how do we bring the child along to the culture of the family, not anybody else's culture, but what is the culture of the family? What do you expect out of a toddler? What do you want out of meal times in preschool? What are you expecting? Do you want them to eat what everybody else eats, or do you want them to have a separate meal with separate things and separate flavors and all of that? What do you use in your household? Do you use lots of small bowls to eat? Do you use one large plate? Is your plate sectioned off? What do you not use plates? And there's sort of a central food in the center, and then you use bread as a form of a utensil or a plate. What does it look like in your household? If you know what the culture of food is for your family and for your household, then that's what we want to be offering the child when they start solids. That becomes our North Star to understand the child needs to be given a child-sized version that is reasonable and safe of that so that they can spend a year sort of like getting all of the skills they need and then be able to enter meal times as a competent cultural member of this community, which feels really good for them as much as it feels really good for you. So, I've pulled out 3 conventional utensils. So these are, pretty standard Western conventional utensils for babies eating. And they're often brightly colored. They're often, and I would look in your drawers in the kitchen and say, in terms of the utensils that I use to eat, does that look anything like this? Are mine brightly colored? Are mine mostly wood? Are mine mostly metal? Like, what do my eating utensils look like? And if they look nothing like this, then we're not preparing the child to actually be absorbed into the family's culture. Whereas in Montessori, there's an intentionality around, and this is quite small. So a very small, this is child size, infant sized, but it probably looks pretty similar to the kinds of spoons that everyone else in the community is using. So there's a lot of developmental reasons why this particular spoon is really helpful to a child, but there's also these cultural reasons of you don't have to get this specific spoon, but I would do some thinking on what does the culture of how I eat, how us as a family eats, and how do we bring the infant along to that. So there's also the food part of eating that I'll get to in a second. But I want to talk through some of the developmental aspects of some of these foods, utensils. So let's take a look at this one. This is a pretty standard infant feeding utensil. This particular one, if you imagine the size of the child's fist, it's maybe about 3 fingers across. If the child is holding the utensil themselves, they're going to poke the back of their throat and gag themselves. This is not a self-feeding utensil. This is a utensil built for the adult to feed the child. But what we know from our little trip into understanding myelin is we know that the hand is myelinated by the time the child is around 6 months, which means that they have some intentional control of their hand, and they are now starting to work on all of their fingers. So the child has the physical capacity to hold something and bring it to their mouth. They've probably been doing it since they were using the ring on the ribbon. They've probably been bringing something to their mouth. And so to not give the child the opportunity to practice holding something and bringing something to their mouth is not giving them the practice that they need to eat the kind of food you expect them to eat. So if the food that you eat as a family mostly involves utensils, then it makes a tremendous amount of sense for the child to start practicing how to do that. And they have the basic motor skills to do it. They just need a tool that isn't going to get in their way. And this kind of tool is built for the adult, not built for the child. Whereas this one let me see, is, whoop, here we are, is so much shorter, where if you imagine the child's fist, if they're holding it, they pretty much can get it in their mouth but not gag themselves, and there's nothing to go here. So as the child practices eating, they're going to say, is the food here, is the food here, where's the food? And they get really clear information that it's never back here. So again, that would also be true with this. This is not a long-handled utensil, but it's so big. So it might as well be, it's intentional for the child, but it's so long and it's really big for the child's mouth. So this is an example of an infant spoon versus what sometimes is handed to the child. And then there's this. So this kind of handle is often not anything that looks like anybody else's. It's also really chunky. It's really, really big. And in terms of as forks are concerned, this is extremely dull because you don't want the child to injure themselves, but it means that the fork doesn't work. So I don't know if you've ever had this experience. If you have a young toddler and the child's trying to use this, if they poke a noodle, the noodle falls right off because it's making too big of a hole. So then they just end up eating with their fingers anyway, because this didn't work. So rather than introducing a fork from the beginning that doesn't work, getting them really good with the spoon so that they practice, learn, poke, figure out, and then all of a sudden they really learn that the only way I get food is from this side. As soon as the child starts eating successfully with the spoon, they're no longer experimenting, they get it. That's a great time to introduce a fork that actually works, that is their size, so that they can practice and you have less of a concern about them experimenting because they've had so much practice with a spoon. So the other part about meal times is the actual food that the child is eating. And in that, I would recommend, again, thinking cultural. So what do you eat in your household? What is the food? Like, let's say, for example, there's a particular kind of stew or soup or curry or chili or something that you eat that has like 22 ingredients, but it is a staple in your household. You eat that once a week, if not more. If that is what you expect the child to be able to eat later, then it can help to sort of backtrack and say, well, if I give my child the full stew at 6 months and it has 22 ingredients in it, and then the child is allergic to something, well, I don't know which one it was, right? So the general idea is that you give things one at a time initially. Always check with your medical provider before you start solids. But generally what they'll tell you is that you start with one food to check for allergies. But rather than starting with something random like cereal, especially if that has nothing to do with what you as a family eat, like if you all eat overnight oats every morning, then sure, it makes sense for the child to have cereal or some kind of thing like that. But if it's something that you don't eat, like pureed broccoli, if that's never on your menu, then that wouldn't be sort of the high thing on the list to think about what you want to give to your child. So rather you would look at the stew and sort of say, well, what's in the stew? It's like, oh, we've got carrots, we've got beans, we've got all kinds of things. So it's like, okay, of all the things to give this child, I'm going to think about giving them something like carrots. And then I have to say, okay, well, carrots are really hard and there might be a choking hazard here. So can I steam the carrots? Can I soften them in a way and then slice them so that the child can actually eat them so that they're kind of mushy, so I don't have to worry about choking, but I can also check for allergies and make sure that the child is getting exposed to the things that once we get a really good sense of whether the child is allergic to anything or not, we can, get on with the stew that everybody else eats, and we can get to the child participating in the family well before they're a toddler. So usually the check for allergies and stuff is usually in the first 2 months. So that's a great time to be checking and practicing and doing all kinds of things. But of all the things, because kids eat food from all over the world, we have so much opportunity. We just want to make sure that it's safe and we're checking for allergies. So we can talk more about meal times. You can pop questions in if you have questions about meal times. But that is our number 3, little deep dive on practical life and some of the tools. The next one, number 4, is a book. And because this is one of the first lives that I'm doing as the Friday Five, I thought I would introduce to you, if you don't know already, my book. So if you are curious about the child's development and you want to know more specifics about food and mealtime and how Montessori works from 0 to 18 months, or at least just understanding how the line is drawn from development to the environment, I would suggest you check it out. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. It is a book that has been illustrated by 6 different women who all took on a chapter. So I worked with a team to make sure that children that were being represented and illustrated throughout the book were being represented in different artistic styles from illustrators of different backgrounds, so that there was a much more authentic representation of children, that not everybody looks the same. And not everybody parents the same, but the idea is that human development is consistent, and that is what we can really sink our teeth into. So it's fully illustrated, and the other thing that I wanted to point out to you is it's also got full developmental charts. So this is the whole section on language, and then it also has full developmental charts on supporting the child with movement and toys, language, sleeping, eating, and hygiene, which includes toileting. And then there's a final section of the book on bonding. I wrote this book after working with over 1,200 families here in Oakland, which is Lashana land. And I worked with these families and started noticing that they were all asking the same questions at specific stages of development, which is understandable because development is predictable. And I thought I would get ahead of myself or get ahead of the game. And I thought I would pre-write notes for families because I was writing like the same thing over and over and over. So I thought, I'm just going to pre-write these. And I'm going to write, the visit notes for 6 months because I already know what people are going to ask me. And once I pre-wrote those notes, I had families who would come to a visit. I'd give them the notes and they would say, oh, these are all typed up. These aren't handwritten anymore. Do you have the next set? Can I take a quick peek at the 8-month notes? Can I take a quick peek at the 12-month notes? And I started noticing that families were really interested in having this sort of whole packet. So I started compiling all the notes of the 2-month visit and the 4 and all that into a packet. And I thought, well, every time I do a home visit, I can, it's so personalized and I'm sitting in the family's home and I'm talking them through things and I'm able to give a lot of context that I don't want to just have these notes with no context. And so I started writing kind of a preamble introduction. And I realized at that moment, I said, oh, you know what? Actually, I think I have the first draft of a book. And I think that I really want to see this as a full comprehensive project, not just hodgepodge together. So I worked on this book for 3 years. It's self-published. So I hope you check it out. It's called Babies Build Toddlers. In the future on the Friday Five, I won't always just talk about this book. I will talk about kids' books or other parenting books and do little reviews, but I thought I'd start with this one. I'm really proud of how it came out, and I'm so excited by all the work the illustrators did for this book. So please check it out. Let me know what you think. So Friday Five, we've got one more to go, and that is going to be parent question. So there's no comments in the chat right now. What I'm going to do is what a lot of families do, is I'm going to go to Facebook. This is what people do to answer questions. And let's see, I'm going to pull up something and then I'm going to put it up so that you can read it too. I'm just going to go to a random parenting group, which is often, this might be something that you do, and look at what a family is asking about. And then I'll talk about what my response would be, and then some possible way that we can rethink the way that we try to access information from the internet. So let's see. I'm trying to pick one out. I'm looking for one for today. And here we go. I'm going to pop this one in the chat. This is a person who posted a couple hours ago. I'm going to see how to do this because I'm not entirely sure how to do this. Oh, look, I did it. So StreamYard makes this very simple. So this family is saying, I've seen a few posts mentioning the need or desire to refrain from the phrase good job or nice work, but I'm not sure why. Can someone explain or point me in the direction for some literature? So this is a family that has 3 kids. They have a 7-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And before I share what my response would be, I'm going to share with you what other people have been telling this person. So this person has over 70 comments in this parenting group, and I want to share with you what people are saying. So I'm going to pull those up and we'll talk through here. Da, 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 da. Oh, there's a lot of like cross posting of videos, so just give me a moment. So one person says, I'm going to pull these up and then I will go through them. So let me just find them for a second. So on Friday 5, when I need to go find something on the internet, there's going to be a moment when I'm looking for good examples for what to do. Let's see. Okay, here's another one. I'm just trying to find things that aren't like cross-posting TED Talks. So I guess one of the things that is interesting. Okay, so here's what I will say about what I'm finding in this little search. So this family is wondering why good job or good work is a problem. She's got a wide span of ages from a 1-year-old to a 3-year-old to a 7-year-old. I'm going to put up different things that people are coming up with, but I was having a hard time sorting through all the comments because there were so many external links. And what I will say is this is a really good example of, I think, the commenters recognizing that this kind of question, it might be better served by hearing from people who've done work in this field, rather than getting sort of various parents' points of view, which often when you post a parenting question, you'll get people who say, it's not that big of a deal. Don't do it that much, right? Like this one, this person said, it's only a problem if it's only used. We want our kids to assess their own success and failures and not rely. Relying too much on outside validation can turn you into a people pleaser and make themselves, and who makes themselves last or doesn't even know what they do or like for themselves. Okay, so that's one answer that you're getting from a family, but you're also getting a ton of people who are saying, hey, watch this TED Talk or check out Growth Mindset. That process of recommending that you might be in the wrong place to get advice is a really good example of what we're trying to do in the app of Parent Montessori, is to actually bring families into spaces where they can get high quality responses that are based centrally on the child's development and the line that Montessori ties to some ideas on what to do about that. So as an international team of Montessori educators, we're highly trained to support families in understanding the development, not just the why. So I appreciate the comments on this post are largely sending this family to other places where they might get a bit more information, because it's similar to that whole idea of the conventional toys. There's not a really obvious line to the child's development here. there is some good points, and the person is also sort of saying, yeah, but don't do it too much. But if we don't understand why this might be negatively impactful to the child's development, then we're much more likely to fall back on our own parenting norms that we're just used to doing. And then we might sort of say, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to say good job, or I'm not supposed to say nice work, but I guess it doesn't matter if it's not too much. But we have no idea why that was even a recommendation. So sending people to where you can get the actual development of how children learn, how they capture learning, and how they stay motivated is going to be really helpful. So I appreciate that the comments are sending people elsewhere, and I pulled up a few of some things that people were saying. So this main one is basically saying, don't worry too much about it. Just don't overdo it because you don't want them to be tied to external motivation. Then we have this person saying that the thinking is that mindless praise like that, after a while you apply it to just everything. That's where the mindless part comes in, creates a situation where the child only does things to get the praise from you instead of doing them for their own fulfillment. So you can try something like, I saw you were able to complete the puzzle, and using a specific accomplishment, like your friend is enjoying the toy you shared with. So this is focused on specific things that you can say or do, less about the information about like why or the development, but it's just sort of saying here are alternatives. Checking with the family if that was helpful. And I think that was the only, there was a lot of cross-posting of TED Talks and going over. So the big idea that I would have is that none of these posts are giving the development. They're going straight to the answers. And I think oftentimes as parents, that is kind of what we think we're looking for. Is we like, get us to the answers, tell me what to do instead. But we're always going to subconsciously fall back on our old sort of parenting habits or things without us understanding. So I'm going to put up this other one now that I've figured out how to put things up. It's so cool. But now let's think about this from a developmental standpoint. Okay. So we're wondering about, why are people telling me good job, not to do good job or nice work? They're not really sure why. What people have offered this person is what to do instead, and some general direction of like external motivation. So let's think about this from each of these age groups. The 1-year-old, developmentally, where is this child? This is a child who has, let's imagine that they're walking, because usually it's around a year that we see the child walking. This is a child who has built so many capacities over the past year. They have done so much in their sensory pathways. They've started to build their language to really understand what you're saying. Maybe they have one word. They're finally able to move and hold on to something at the same time. That is brand new for them. Before, when they were sitting, they could either hold or not hold, but they couldn't move. And then when they started crawling, cruising, pulling to stand, all of that, they had to use their hands to go anywhere. So holding and moving at the same time was not accessible to them as much, although some kids figure it out. But around 12 months, this is a child who has built so much of themselves. They're really starting to tap into language. Their hands are finally free while they're moving. It's a really exciting time. And what is on the child's mind is, I like to say, it's kind of like they spent a year building a car. Like they've built an amazing car, and somebody just handed them the keys. Of course, they're going to want to take it for a spin. And of course, they don't know all the rules. So the toddler is highly motivated to become capable. They do not want you to do it for them. They want to do things for themselves, and they will either push you away with their words or their actions when we try to do things for them. They are highly motivated to do things. And yet, if we use good job or nice work, we're adding in a component of value to the work that they are doing. So it's kind of like, if the child has got this car and they've just gotten the keys to it, and of course they don't know all the road rules and all of that, but they're driving it around. It's really fun. And we have to stop them and say, hey, this is actually a stop sign. And, the double yellow line means you don't go over there. We have to teach them the rules so that they can be the most free. We have to do that with toddlers. But let's say on the road, instead of them getting to decide where they're going and what they're developing, maybe they say, I try to go around a bend and I didn't quite know how to do that. So I want to go find a place that has lots of bends so I can practice that. Or, whatever it is that they're practicing, if they're on the road trying to do the bends and then all of a sudden they see this big shiny arrow and it's blinking and it's exciting and, mommy's over there saying like, come over here, we're completely derailing what the child was trying to do. So we have to remember how much of an impact we have on our child, because our child not only loves us exactly who we are, they also have a lot of value in you supporting them because they're still really little and they're still looking at us like, yes, I'm kind of on my own, but it's also, I don't know how to do all of this myself. So I'm also expecting you to be there with me, even though I don't want you to do it myself. And so saying things like good job or nice work is kind of like that big, bright, flashy sign where the child, of course, is going to go that direction. Of course, is going to want to go and get that validation from you. Of course, they're going to want to go and be with you. But what we end up doing is that the child doing that so often, they end up never getting on that road to practice the turns because they completely forgot. They were just over here. And so we can completely derail what they were internally trying to work on. Have you ever tried to help your child do something that they didn't want to do? They did not want to be working on that right now? Of course we have. It happens all the time. And it's frustrating because they don't want to do that right now. It's a lot easier when they really want to do something right now. And we come alongside them and we sort of say, hey, like, you really obviously want to be all up in the kitchen and I don't even know what to do with you. But instead of getting frustrated, I'm going to like give you an avenue to be here. Then we're both happy. As long as I have given you something that I feel really good about you taking on. So for the child's experience, that it's so much more beneficial for their own development that they can know, I know I need to work on this, so I'm going to go work on this. They satiate and work towards something to potential, and then they move on. And then they satiate and they work on something to potential. And then they realize, oh man, I have to go back over here and build the skill up a little bit more. If they're directing themselves without distraction, we're going to see so much more potential. But when we start adding in, that was good, this was good work, which also communicates there is such a thing as bad work and not a good job. And I communicate that when I stop saying anything, the child ends up chasing the bright, flashy line instead of what they should be working on, which is what their body and brain are telling them, hey, this would be really helpful if we did this. So that's the 1-year-old. The 3-year-old is even more independent. So this is a child who's now moving out of this toddler phase. They've built a language. They're not just like one word. They've got sentences. And they really do want to move out from the adult sphere. They want some independence. They want some control. And if they feel derailed because of what we value or we don't value, sometimes they'll be like, bright sign, I'm going to go the opposite direction. Even though what we want them to do is be on the path that they were trying to be on in the first place. And then the 7-year-old now as well. The 7-year-old is now moving into a space of they are functionally competent. They really are, as 6 years old, they're not just have a base language. They really can communicate pretty thoroughly and they can understand pretty thoroughly. I like to give the example of the difference between a 3 and a 6-year-old is if the child was alone, like just happened to be alone, even though the 3-year-old might be capable of getting a snack and they might be capable of toileting and they might be capable of changing their clothes, if they were alone and they soiled themselves, or if they were hungry or something, would they be able to do all the steps to figure that out? Less likely with the 3-year-old, even if they have those basic skills. A 6-year-old, yes, they would be able to handle that. They would be able to change out of their clothes, take a quick shower or a bath, put on fresh clothes and make themselves a sandwich. Like that is something that a 6-year-old could possibly conceivably do developmentally. And so for each of these ages, there's a tremendous growth towards independence. And if we are using our value of what we believe on the child, we are going to start, the more independence they have, the more they're going to use that independence to get away from that, as opposed to not doing that and allowing the child to be on their path. Obviously, with some basic limits, like you got to stop at the stop sign and you can't do this and you have to come home before dark and all the things that we know that they can't just get the keys to this imaginary car and just go on with it. It really, really is about the derailing of the child's inner developmental path, that I don't need to remind a child to sort of say, hey, excuse me, it's time to crawl. They will move their body until they figure that out. That's just how development works. It depends on myelin. It depends on their movement. It depends on their opportunity to practice, but they will move their body until they figure that out. That is the path of development. We're not part of that. We cannot force the child to crawl at 7 months. Like that's not going to happen. If that's in the cards, then the child does that, but we don't have a say. And so it's the same thing, is about whether or not we're allowing the child to be on the path that they're trying to be on, which allows them to build the kind of skills that the brain and the body know are important for human success as a mature person of their time and place, or whether we completely derail them by telling them this is more valuable and this road is better and that one's not. So that is the big idea, is that can be a big derailer. And the thing with praise like this is it can be a big derailer even after you stop doing it, because it gets in their head. It becomes part of their inner monologue. And that inner monologue is really being built at the same time the child is developing language in the first 6 years. So it's good to be mindful. The families that were on here commenting and saying things like, praising effort or looking into growth mindset of sort of saying, oh, you worked really hard on that. Or, I saw that you really pushed through the frustration, focusing it on the child, on their building of skills rather than an accomplishment. All of those are practical suggestions that you probably could come up with. Or if you want actual feedback on this is what happened with my kid and what is a possible script I could use, come on into Parent Montessori and come talk to an early childhood educator to not only understand the child's development, but also to then put it into use. So I figured out the YouTube Live. I'm personally proud of myself, even though I spoke for 15 minutes before even noting it was not recording. But Friday 5 is every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'm glad that you joined me, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks for watching.